You know, there's a lot going on in our world today. And I've wrestled with for the last 3 or 4 days because we're in week 2 of a series. And I prayed about it, and for the church, for what Jesus has called us to do, I'm just going to tell you before we start, this one's tough. It's been tough on me for 2 or 3 weeks. But I want you to listen, and I want you to evaluate what Jesus is telling us today. That is my request from you today. Let me ask you this. Have y'all ever seen those car dealership commercials? You know, where they say, anybody can buy a car here, right? And they go through their whole spiel and they convince you in their little 30-second spot that even you could buy a car from them. But if you notice in those commercials, down at the bottom in the print that if you've even got good eyes, you probably can't see, it tells you what anyone really means, doesn't it? It's like anyone can buy a car here if you can pass the credit check. Or have you ever tried to get a special deal on a cell phone? And I've got a really good friend where I grew up that's a cell phone dealer. So if he watches from time to time, so he's probably perked up right now just because I said that. But you see those commercials all the time for cellular phones, right? And the commercial claims the deal that they've got is for anyone. And then you find out that the discount is really only for certain people, isn't it? And it sure seems like today, whenever people say anyone is welcome or anyone can cash in on this deal, they don't really mean anyone, do they? There always seems to be some kind of catch prior to making the deal. And in Luke 23, Jesus says these words to all of this crowd who was around him. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And what Jesus is telling this crowd, and what he is still telling us today, is this. When it comes to Jesus, anyone is welcome. When making this invitation to these potential followers, Jesus invites anyone. But it seems like over the years we've gotten to the point where when we hear even Jesus say anyone, there's a lot of people in our world that will immediately think, okay, what's the catch? We went just a few days ago to look at I didn't even know what it was really called, but I'm up on terms now. We went to look at a venue. And for this upcoming wedding that I guess is going to really happen. And as we went, this place that we went had most everything that our kids wanted. And even more importantly for the parents, the price was very competitive to all the other venues that we've even talked about. But here's the thing, all these other venues that we've talked about and looked at, when you purchase the venue for that day, you get the venue. And then you got to rent all the other stuff, right? But this one that we looked at offered most everything as a part of the package deal. So guess what my first question was? What's the catch, right? What are you going to bill me for once you get me to sign up for this thing? And I want you to know that when it comes to Jesus, there is no catch. There's no catch. There's no small fine print or hidden fees. It is all laid out in one verse. And if you don't hear anything else today, please hear this. Following Jesus is open to anyone. And when Jesus says anyone, What this huge crowd that's following Jesus, when he says anyone, immediately what they're going to do is they're going to look at his current disciples. And when they look at his disciples, they're going to know without a doubt that he actually meant it. And what we've got to understand that we may not understand today is, to this crowd that Jesus says these words to, Jesus was a rabbi at this time. And yeah, he was homeless and he could be a little bit unconventional, but he was a rabbi nonetheless. And what being a rabbi basically meant was, a rabbi was a teacher of God's word. And we've also got to remember at this time that God's word was only the Old Testament. And every rabbi that there was in these days had an extensive knowledge of the Torah. They had all of these writings from all of these prophets. And rabbis were also special people because they had this group of followers. And they were referred to as the Talmud. And the word Talmud just simply means a disciple or a student. So every rabbi had his own class of students. And that group, those students, was also a very exclusive group of students, because most people didn't end up as students of rabbis. In fact, all those who did not make the cut ended up learning some kind of trade to make a living. And in most cases, it was a trade that had been passed down in their family that they did. But for those who wanted to become a Talmud of a particular rabbi, what they had to do is they had to go through this very difficult, long, thorough application process. And there were a lot of requirements that would have to be met before they would even be considered by the rabbi. It would have kind of been like trying to get into an Ivy League school today. Because today, if you want to go to Harvard, you better have a 4.0 GPA, or at least a 32 on your ACT, or at least a 1600 on your SAT, because without those kind of stats, and probably even with those stats today, you may have a difficult time getting in. And it was the same way in applying to a rabbi. It was very intense, and it was a very difficult process. And these rabbis had to be thorough. And they had to be thorough because the excellence of a student reflected the excellence of the rabbi. So a rabbi would not just let anybody into following them. If he just let anybody in, he wouldn't be very sought after as a teacher. But then Jesus comes along, and Jesus changes the system, especially when he invites a tax collector to be one of his Talmud. You see, when Jesus asked Matthew to follow him, it was crystal clear that Jesus' invitation was not just for the religious elite of the day, or not just for those who had their lives all together, because Jesus' invitation was truly for all of us. Jesus invited anyone. And you know, anyone is a pretty inclusive word. Because when Jesus says anyone can follow, Jesus means anyone. And anyone even means anybody who has ever thought, you know what, I think I went too far. Or my history's just too bad. Anyone also means anyone who has ever laid awake at night and said, I can't believe I did that. Anyone who has ever looked at themselves in the mirror and said, I can't believe what I've become. Because, church, anyone can follow Jesus. So when the word gets out about this new rabbi who is picking out followers at random, people start wondering what in the world's going on. And they came to hear this incredible teacher named Jesus. But when they looked at his disciples, they They had to be really confused because it was so different than anything they'd ever seen. They must have shook their heads when they looked at these disciples and they thought, those guys are his students? Them? They're nobodies. Those two right there, they used to be fishermen. And those guys over there, they're just political hotheads. And that guy right there, that guy is a local tax collector. But when Jesus made the invitation, and then people heard that anyone could follow him and learn from this rabbi, I'm sure they at least started to, at least in the back of their mind, they began to entertain the idea that they might be anyone. You see, these people that Jesus is talking to when he says this verse, they've given up on the hope and the dream of learning from a rabbi a long, long time ago. But now all of a sudden they begin wondering if they really could be welcomed into this new rabbi's group. And slowly but surely, people begin to come and they begin to follow. And they begin to learn from this rabbi named Jesus. And they realize when Jesus said anyone, he actually meant it. And when Jesus said anyone was welcome, the crowd began to understand that meant everyone is welcome. And that's still true today because anyone also means everyone. But here's the real struggle, church. And this struggle is real. And even though we would never admit it or say it out loud, but here's the thing, if we're going to be completely transparent, then we have to admit that today we don't really always completely buy into this idea that church should really just be for anyone. Because if we're honest, we really like church the way it is. And honestly, our preference is really for things just to stay the same. But church, when this happens over time, when things just stay the same, and that happens over time, what the same slowly does is the same slowly becomes the standard. And pretty soon after it becomes the standard then becomes a qualification. And I really think Jesus knew that was how it was going to go all along. And I think that's why he said in Luke 9 and verse 23 that when it comes to following him, it's anyone, and there shouldn't be any qualifications because following Jesus is open to anyone, and it's open to everyone. So Jesus does away with all of these qualifications that all these rabbis have, and Jesus wanted everyone to follow him as a rabbi. So Jesus gets rid of this long list of prerequisites that all the rabbis had, and he did away with all the standard application processes. And I share all of that with you today, church, because I want to tell you this. I think that if Jesus did that when he was calling all of these people to follow him, then I really think that the church that says that they follow Jesus today should follow suit and follow Jesus' lead and do what Jesus did, and also do away with all of our own qualifications. And I know what you're thinking right now. What in the world is he talking about? Because we don't have any unwritten code, do we? I've never seen it because it's unwritten. But I want you to be open with yourself. I want to be honest with your church experiences. And I just want you to at least evaluate what we're going to talk about. Let's flesh this out. Because these are things that we don't really talk about. And I want to do that just to have you consider, are there any unwritten codes that we might have today? And I want you to consider that, because if we do, and we're going to follow Jesus, we may need to look at getting rid of those. For instance, there is still, to some extent today, kind of this unwritten dress code, isn't there? And although we've made great strides, church, you have no idea how many people every week that come up here for help, and we invite them to come to church. What do you think the first thing they say is? I don't have anything to wear. I'd love to come, but I don't have anything to wear. And as the preacher, what do I immediately respond back without even thinking? Well, come as you are. And then they chuckle because they're thinking, yeah, right, I've done that before. A lot of them think that way because of past experiences that they or their friends have had. And some of them think that way because they know if they come as they are, then at least one person that's going to be there is going to give them the look. Y'all know the look, don't you? I got the look when I was a kid in high school. When my mama told me to wear something and I wore something else. Y'all know the look, right? And they get the look because of who they are and because of what everybody else in the room knows about their past, and two, because of what they're wearing. Unwritten code. And I'm also very thankful that in the time that I've been here, I don't know that this has happened. I'm thankful for that. Or at least it hasn't happened where I've actually witnessed it. But I have actually heard on a couple of different occasions in my time here, when someone from outside of this group comes into this community to worship here with us, people who are still in this building today actually say something to the effect of, did you see old so-and-so that's here today? And of course I replied, yes, I did. Isn't that awesome? And they would say something like, I never thought in a million years they would show up here of all places. And by the way, did you see what they were wearing? In church, I'm going to tell you today, if that's happening, that is an unwritten code. But not only that, over the past few decades, there's also been another one that's become a little bit of an unwritten political code. And I know you know what I'm talking about this one, right? That unwritten code where if you don't lean the way that I lean politically and you don't agree with everything that everyone else agrees with, then we know somebody's wrong, and we also know it's you. Because, I mean, after all, we know, and we know that we're right. And most of the time, we even have a verse to prove it. And if you don't believe us, then just ask us, because we're more than willing to tell you about our unwritten code. And if you don't think that we have some kind of unwritten political code, I want to challenge you just to listen to the conversations that you have in this building on Sunday mornings. Because church, just today, I have counted at least 7 times since I've been in this building this morning where someone has brought up some kind of political issue. And here's the thing, church, if we could just, because I see it, thinking, what are you doing? I want you to stop. I want you just to think. Just think for a second. Quit being defensive. Quit being offended. And instead of being defensive and being offended and getting ready to explode because you want to prove your point, I challenge you today finally to be heartbroken. Be heartbroken enough to realize that things like that and conversations like that can actually lead people away from the church. If we could just be honest with ourselves and with each other, And churches, just you're going to find this in churches everywhere. There's these unwritten codes. And I've done preaching long enough to know when I go from preaching to meddling, so I'm just going to meddle for a second, but I just briefly want you to examine a few more things. How about the unwritten code of whether you should ever consume any alcohol or not? Or whether you should really listen to that kind of music? Or you said you make how much money? Or what's really your social agenda? And if we are willing to be honest and at least evaluate these things, here's what we're going to find. That list can stack up pretty quickly, can it? And what we often miss that whole time, and when we're doing all that, because we get defensive and we get offended, is in the same breath that all churches all over America keep saying, but you know, anyone's welcome. But think about this for a second. When you are that person who is on the outside and you've heard about this Jesus guy, and you've heard over and over again that he really invites anyone, and he invites everyone to follow him, and you just can't help it anymore. So you've got to go and to see and decide for yourself if it's really true, because it sounds like those car commercials way too much. So you want to go and see, and then you come in here, and the first conversation that you walk up when you walk in is from a member of this church talking about political issues. And what happens is it becomes very clear to them that what they have been told about Jesus, where anyone can come, and what they've experienced from the people that say that they follow him, what they've seen for themselves is it is just like everything else. It's too good to be true. And sadly, in most cases, what they find is there are some unwritten qualifications, and there is some fine print. And that is because what we do or what we say tells them that what they've been told about coming to Jesus was really too good to be true. Because according to what they have witnessed, there are some unwritten codes. And nobody told them about that. And it has them run from Jesus instead of to him. And so, church, I promise you, I'm not here to make you feel bad. And I know what all's going on in our world. I know. And it's horrible. I sat with my daughter Friday as she bawled about what's going on in our world. But church, we live in a broken world. And what we should see through what's going on in our world is Jesus is coming back. And it should create this urgency in us to get over ourselves enough to see that the end is coming. And there's a job that we have to do as followers of his in sharing the good news of the gospel, so those people that we know have a chance to be with us in eternity forever. Instead of sitting around the coffee pot back there talking about what we think should be happening. That's what should be happening as followers of Jesus. So I beg us today, let's stop debating them. And let's stop correcting them. And let's stop trying to conform them to what we think they should be. And let's stop denying them, even if it's unintentional on our part, because Jesus didn't do that. And if we're followers of Jesus, we shouldn't either. No qualifications means no excuses. When Jesus said anyone, Jesus got rid of all the excuses. When Jesus invites anyone to follow him, he doesn't just break down the barriers that keep so many people from learning more about God. He also gets rid of all the excuses that all the different people were hiding behind. So let me ask you today, what has your excuse been? I think a lot of people today have been holding out on a relationship with Jesus because we say, we're just too busy. So what is it for you? Is it because you're too busy putting in hours at the office? Is it because you've really been focusing on your marriage? Is it because the kids are just requiring a lot of attention right now? Is it because times have been tough and now you've had to take on a second job? Maybe it's your past that you're not proud of. So the baggage or the addiction or the divorce or the bankruptcy, it's been an excuse for a long time. And it's easy to hide behind those kind of excuses because who's going to argue with someone who's been through a tragedy or someone who is emotionally scarred? But Jesus gets rid of the excuses when he invites anyone. Anyone is welcome to have a relationship with Jesus. Sexual past, anyone. Ex-con, anyone. Inmate, anyone. Recently divorced, anyone. Legalist, anyone. Alcoholic, anyone. Pharisee, anyone. Addict, anyone. Hypocrite, anyone. And I share all of this with you today because if we really decide to go from being a fan to being a follower of Jesus, we've got to be ready as a church for what can happen when we embrace this invitation for everyone. Because if anyone really can come to church, if we decide to be that church where anyone can come, then I'm promising you one thing for sure is going to happen. It's going to mess up a lot of our current things. Because all of a sudden, the church will get filled, but it's going to be full of unchurched people. And if we really start accepting anyone into our churches to follow Jesus, then we are going to be forced to deal with all of our unwritten codes and all of our normal plans. We'll be forced to get out of our comfort zone. We'll be forced to rub shoulders with people who come from different music collections and different recreational activities. People whose wardrobe, they're going to confuse us or annoy us, one of the two. People who are just hard to tolerate. And as hard to tolerate as they are, they're even harder to love. But true Jesus followers are willing to break down those walls. They're willing to trash the unwritten codes. They're really willing to welcome anyone into God's family. And I've been here long enough, I can see the fidgeting and some of you look like you're about to get up and come up here because you're thinking, wait a minute, we can't let anyone into the church. We can't just let people show up and invite them into God's family and tolerate anything that's not biblical. And you're right. We can't. I'm not saying that we tolerate or we condone anything sinful, because when a person comes to the point where they want to be a Christian, of course, we as followers of Jesus have to make sure they understand, not that they understand not just what we want to tell them about what God says and what about God doesn't say, but we actually take the time to show them God's word, and then we step back and we allow them to make the decision that they can only make. That's not our decision, that's theirs. But we've also got to remember that when Jesus makes this invitation, Jesus, who we follow, says anyone. And so some of the people who respond to that invitation are going to have a past. In church, some of their past is going to be some stuff that you probably are really not going to approve of. And some of them are going to have been involved in lifestyles that you're going to be embarrassed to hear about. And what I can tell you about fans of Jesus is they just don't really know how to deal with all of that stuff. They just don't know how to deal with it, because fans of Jesus, if they're being honest, they just really prefer not to know. They just don't want to know. Fans of Jesus really prefer relationships and things to be much more shallow and much more comfortable. And fans of Jesus, when they ask someone how they're doing, they don't really want to hear how they're doing. They just want you to reply fine so they can check off that they spoke to you today. But followers of Jesus are always willing to listen, even to the difficult stuff. And followers of Jesus are always willing to hear the story of brokenness and of sin. And even after they've heard all of that, followers of Jesus are still willing to welcome those people with open arms. And church, the next point is crucial to making sure that we help all, both brand new Christians and longtime believers, move into a completely committed relationship with Jesus. It's anyone, but it's also everything. When Jesus makes this invitation, he welcomes anyone who would come after him. But Jesus also makes it crystal clear that when you choose to follow him, you're giving up everything. So it is anyone, but it is also everything. When a Talmud finally was accepted into a rabbi's school, what they would do is they would leave their homes, they would leave their jobs, they would leave whatever it was that was holding them back, and they would go and follow that rabbi wherever he went. So if that rabbi decided to go to the market, his students would follow. And if the rabbi decided to walk over to another town, his students would follow. And if the rabbi needed to go visit someone who was in a sick area, his students would follow. But for the rabbi Jesus, it cost even more. Because if the rabbi Jesus decided to live without a home, his students would follow and live without a home. And if Jesus, the rabbi, decided to go among the outcast and the downlooked, people that are downlooked upon, and the sinners and all the shameful people in the community, his students follow. And even if Jesus, the rabbi, decided not to flee from persecution, his students would stay and stand by his side as the persecution took place. In church, I know it's been tough, and it's as plainly as I can put it. That is the life that Jesus offers to us. That's the life he calls us to. The greatest teacher who ever lived on the face of the earth offers you today a chance to become one of his students. And when Jesus says anyone, Jesus means everyone. And when Jesus says anyone, he really means anyone. So that means anyone with no qualifications, because with Jesus, you no longer have an excuse. But even though he makes his invitation to anyone, Jesus also wants you to know, and he guarantees you, it's going to cost you everything. So I ask you today, are you ready? Are you ready for that calling today? Are you willing to finally step out of the stands and stop being a fan and actually get into the game and follow this rabbi we call Jesus the way that he calls us to follow him? And as in giving your life to Jesus or claiming that you're a follower of his, at the end of the day, Jesus gives you the choice to choose what you're going to do. There's no fine print. There's no hidden fees. Jesus lays it out that it's going to cost you everything. But he also promises you a home in eternity with him one day again, where all will be made new. And if you're here today and you're ready to give your life to Jesus, he waits for you now. And he invites you to come while we stand and sing.